Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian. I am Bendy Bono, here for the final, at least for now, video in my series Fantasy and the Academy, in which we are exploring the way that different fantasy series can help us to interact with various academic subjects. So we've talked about Lord of the Rings and how that series and Tolkien's works as a whole can help us explore things like philology and mythology and sacramental view of faith and of life. And then we looked at George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and talked about history and social justice, and how the series is a very fascinating exploration of those areas, as well as literary criticism of the fantasy genre. And today we're going to finish off by talking about Steven Erikson's Malazan Book of the Fallen. Now, I'm going to go ahead and admit right off the bat here that both for this series and for the academic subjects that I'm going to be tying it to, I have the least amount of knowledge of any of the subjects we've covered thus far in this series of videos. In the case of Malazan Book of the Fallen, I have not actually finished the 10-book series. I will explain in a little bit why I think that that's probably is okay for doing at least some preliminary discussion. And in the case of the academic areas that Steven Erikson interacts with, things like anthropology, sociology, and archaeology, I also am not super familiar with those. So I don't intend to promote this video as me being an expert on the areas of study that Steven Erikson explores, but rather as somebody who wants to say and finds that making a video is a worthwhile way of saying that this fantasy series is A, worth your time as a reader, and B, is an intelligently written series and one that it is worth keeping your eyes open for some of these different themes that I will point out for you, even if I myself may not be able to extrapolate them quite as well as someone else with more knowledge in both the series itself and the fields at play would. Now, the Malazan Book of the Fallen is probably almost definitely, I should say, the least well-known of the three series that we have covered. Lord of the Rings, of course, needs no introduction, nor does A Song of Ice and Fire, due to the popularity of Game of Thrones over the last several years. However, not so the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which may be known within certain fantasy circles and has a very loyal following, but truth be told, is nowhere near the level of popularity of either Tolkien or Martin. So this series actually began as a world for a role-playing game developed by Steven Erikson and his sort of not really co-author, Ian Esselmont. I will get to him in just a second. They eventually decided, or at least Steven Erikson decided, that he was going to develop this world that they had created for their role-playing adventures into a screenplay for a movie. The screenplay was never actually accepted or developed, and Steven Erikson later developed that screenplay into the first novel in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, The Gardens of the Moon. That novel lay dormant for, I believe, a better part of a decade before it was eventually sold to a publisher who ordered the book to a series, from which Steven Erikson outlined his plan for 9 more novels, bringing the entire series to a total of 10, the 10th novel having been completed just a couple of years ago. Now, in addition to the main 10-book series, Ian Esselmont has written his own tie-in novels that are not directly a part of the main Malazan Book of the Fallen series, but are more supplemental to it, explore different parts of the world that Erikson was unable to get to or intentionally left open for his co-creator, I think might be the best term. So they've never actually written together as far as I know, but yet they share this universe and their books interact with one another within it. I have not read any of Ian Esselmont's, and within Malazan Book of the Fallen fans, he is regarded as the lesser of the two. But as I said, I have no personal experience with him just yet. Now, having finished the 10-book series, Steven Erikson is working on a prequel trilogy at the present, and I believe has plans for future supplemental novels within the world that fall outside of the 10-book series itself. Now, the series is quite famous for its complexity. It contains vast swaths of characters and plot points, and different books will alternate between ongoing locations and sets of characters. I remarked in my Goodreads review of The Gardens of the Moon that if you are a George R.R. Martin fan who has ever thought, I wish that this series, meaning A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, just had a few hundred more characters and a couple dozen more plot lines and was just a little bit more confusing, then this is indeed the series for you. Make no mistake that it is something of a labyrinthine effort to read. Even the most dedicated followers of the series have remarked that it is perhaps better as a reread than a first read, so that you actually comprehend what is going on. And having myself reread the first few books in the series due to not being able to finish, not because I didn't like the series, but due to time constraints in my life at the time, during my first attempt to read through it, I can confirm that you do get more out of this series on a reread. Now, given that each of the books in the series is about as long as one of George R.R. Martin's books, that's quite an intimidating prospect. So this series is not for the faint of heart, yet for the dedicated fantasy fan, it is well worthwhile and quite intelligently written, as we'll get into in just a second. Let me just describe a bit more of the world and the plot so that you will have a better idea, if you have not read the series, of what I'm referring to when we get into our academic subjects. So the plot of the main 10-book series takes place on 3 different continents, depending on which book you are reading. So The Gardens of the Moon, which is the first book, and largely standalone, takes place on the continent of Genebacus, where the Malazan Empire is invading and is attempting to conquer the free cities of Genebacus, if you will. And then the other two, the second book goes to a different continent that has kind of an Arabian desert type feel. Third book goes back to Genebacus. Fourth book back to the Arabian type continent, which I apologize, I've forgotten its name. And then the fifth book, we get an entirely new location, entirely new sets of characters, and slowly these begin to weave their way into a larger plot with a shadowy figure called the Crippled God, or the Chained God, who proves to be the ultimate antagonist of the series. Along the way, there are enormous amounts of characters, many of whom will appear only briefly and then go away. The first book is largely standalone in and of itself, yet the plots return from it in the second book and then are developed further throughout the series. Now, within the world itself, Erikson, as you might imagine from that rather large swath he has chosen to paint from, is dealing with a variety of cultures and creatures who are all interacting within this world. There are also a series of shadowy, godlike figures known as ascendants. Now, for all intents and purposes, ascendants are gods, yet not quite, because any mortal has the potential to ascend, hence the name Ascendant, and take on these godlike qualities. Now, there are ascendants who have been around for millennia and ascendants who have been around for only a handful of years within the series, and finding out who is who, what their various allegiances are, what their various plots and desires are, and how those things shift throughout the course of the novels is part of the attraction to this series. So, I hardly would call my brief summary there doing the series justice. I would encourage you, of course, if you're interested in the series, to do a bit more research on your own through Wikipedia or through interacting with the very large and enthusiastic Malazan fan community out on Facebook or on various forums dedicated to the series on the internet. But for our purposes, let us move on to some of the academic content. Now, I'm going to be drawing my examples from the second book in the series, Dead House Gates, but never fear, spoiler phobes. I'm not going to spoil anything in the first book, nor anything in the second book, because these two books, as I mentioned, take place on separate continents and only carry over a few characters from one to the other. For all intents and purposes, their plots are largely distinct, allowing this conversation to take place while referencing the second book without ruining anything of the surprises in the first book. Now, that said, because of the labyrinthine nature of this series, I would actually encourage you to delve into some spoilers for the sake of helping you not to be overly confused and lost while reading it. But that aside, let's move on. So let's talk briefly about these three areas: anthropology, sociology, and archaeology. Let's start with those first two, anthropology and sociology. And the second book in the series is quite prominent with these themes because we are given a very interesting canvas in terms of our plot. On this continent, which again, I apologize that I don't remember its name off the top of my head at the moment, but we have the continent that has been conquered by the Malazan Empire, which spans all across this massive world that Steven Erikson and Ian Esselmont have devised. Now, this continent, its native people, the Wiccans, have various tribes, very nomadic people. They have been subdued, but not for long, because that continent is beginning to rise in rebellion. The people are about to throw off the chains of their Malazan oppressors, if you will, and take back their land. And what Erikson does, though, that is very interesting, is that we see a large part of this portion of the plot through a Wiccan commander named Coltane. Cotillion is another character. You can see how difficult it is to keep these names straight. But Commander Coltane, who, when the Malazan Empire first invaded, fought the Malazan forces, but is now a Wiccan commander controlling Malazan forces and hoping to suppress the rebellion. And Erikson does this some very interesting things with the character of Coltane as he becomes a hero for his men throughout the course of the novel, becomes a sacrificial figure, becomes somebody who represents in some sense both cultures, the Malazan and the Wiccans, but yet also neither, as he is truly aligned with neither, but yet is doing what he feels is the right thing for the sake of his land, of his home, of his people. And that's where Erikson starts to get into some very sociological themes and anthropological themes here in the course of this novel. We see that with Coltane, the way that allegiances can shift, even among honorable men, which he very much is, that it isn't that he has been bought off by the Malazans, but yet that the whole concept of what it means to belong to a society and to a people is at times a fluid one, and even though he is fully immersed in his culture, he does not go along with them in the rebellion. And it becomes a fascinating way to explore the clash of these various cultures that are going on in this rebellion through the eyes of Coltane and his people. And as various Malazan soldiers under his command begin to identify less with the Empire itself and more with him, so do his own soldiers be drawn out of any resentment they have of the Malazan Empire or any desire to join the rebellion. They are in it for Coltane. They desire to follow this leader, to be a part of what he is building, to create a worthwhile people and a society. And that's just one example, but you see instances like this pop up again and again throughout the series as Erikson challenges us through the clash of various cultures to explore what does culture actually mean? And more to the point, as we get more to the anthropological side of that, what does it mean to be an individual within these huge, enormous collisions of forces seemingly beyond our control? What does it mean to be loyal to either an empire or to a people group when those things are constantly in motion, and even the empire itself seems to change from season to season. And what we find throughout the series is that more often what Erikson wants us to latch on to isn't so much that the theme that he seems to want to come back to isn't so much that it's about what people group you belong to or whose side you take, but it's about a personal integrity that is about finding people you can be loyal to, causes that are worth standing for regardless of what side they're particularly aligned with, and choosing to believe in those on a more personal level. He challenges us to find the individual and the pieces of meaning and purpose in the midst of a chaotic, overwhelming, larger-than-life madness. Now, on the other side, with archaeology, we find a very interesting exploration of this within ascendants and within different cultures. Of course, archaeology seeks to sort of sift through the various levels of time in a particular place, and how did one culture build beyond another. And using the lack of constraints that a fantasy setting allows him, Erikson's able to explore this in a very fascinating way by, especially through the Ascendants, bringing people from different times into a single narrative and allowing them to interact together. It's very similar to what I just described him doing sociologically with the horizontal clash of cultures, but in the case of Ascendants, and then with a few other races that are long dead and old conflicts that begin to pop up with, members of these long forgotten races seem to rear their ugly heads again. We also get that vertical conflict that takes place. As I mentioned, among the Ascendants, we have Ascendants who are around for only a few decades and some that have been around for millennia upon millennia. And so really what Erikson is trying to do in the mess of this huge, confusing narrative and hundreds of different characters is almost, in a sense, allow us to embrace the overwhelming character of his narrative, and in so doing experience what his characters experience in the overwhelming horizontal, sociological, and vertical archaeological clashes that they themselves are a part of. And he encourages us in the midst of that to latch on to those who we choose to believe in, regardless of what side they are aligned with. Similarly to George R. R. Martin's series, there really are no good or bad guys per se in this series. However, unlike Martin's, where it seems like just about everybody's bad, this is somewhat of the flip side, where we do see all these different sides, none of which in and of themselves are good or bad, but we see causes and individuals who we can choose to believe in as readers. And as such, Erikson in some ways explores the flip side of what Martin has done with his swathes of gray that cloud his characters and his world. So, as I said, I don't have nearly as much to say about the academic part of Steven Erikson as I did on the other videos. But yet I wanted to briefly throw those out there and just encourage you to dive into the series. Do consider taking on the enormous effort involved in reading it and enjoying it. But as you do so, to pay attention to those topics and allow yourself to become a more observant, well-informed, and wiser, more knowledgeable reader along the way. Alright, so as I said, that is it for this series, at least for the moment. It's something I certainly will leave the door open to revisiting, because I think it's a fascinating topic. As far as what's coming next for me in these Sci-Fi Christian videos, I have some ideas for, I want to do some videos exploring some stuff within Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. I don't know if I'm going to organize those as a series or just several loosely tied together one-off videos. And then throughout the Lent and Easter season, I am going to be doing a series of reflections on a read-through of the Divine Comedy. This will be different than what we did with Paradise Lost. I'm not going to make the effort at this time to wholly dive into that with a series of analyses for each canto, but I do want to offer a series of reflections and do a read-through of those throughout the Lent and Easter season. So look for an introductory video of that around the 1st of February. And then, of course, you can see me on the Bendy Bono Beer Show, on my Reading the Summa project that I've been doing, which you can find on Facebook. You can see the introduction video from a couple videos back to that. And, of course, first and foremost, listening to the Sci-Fi Christian podcast, where thankfully you don't have to merely listen to me drone on and on there, because I am well balanced by my intrepid co-host Matthew Anderson. So if you are only a video watcher and have not listened to the Sci-Fi Christian podcast, you are missing out on the better half of the Sci-Fi Christian. So I'd encourage you to check all of those out. But for sure, I will be back in February with the Dante read-through, and I'm quite looking forward to it. But for now, I am Bendy Bono, and this is the Sci-Fi